Okay, it gave a live stream notification.
Yeah. Here we go. Hello. Sorry for a late start. Welcome to Climate Chat. I'm your host, Dan Miller. And today we have a special guest, Ken Berlin. And I've known Ken for super long time. I can't even remember how long it's been. Ken has done some amazing things related to energy and climate and the environment. We're going to learn about, in fact, he's done so many different things that we're going to have to sort of limit our conversation on each subject just so we can get through it all. But to start off, just so you can understand who Ken is and the kinds of things he's done, first I want to welcome Ken. Welcome to the show. And please, could you give us a little bit of a taste of the background of things you worked on and what you're working on now?
Okay, well, Dan, thank you very much for having me on the program, and thank you everybody for joining us. Just briefly, I spent most of my career as an environmental and climate and eventually climate change lawyer, mainly working in large law firms, ending at the law firm Skadden Arps. I left Skadden in 2010, and in 2010, I formed with one of my friends something called the Coalition for Green Capital. We're the entity that started the concept of green banks. I spent 2010 and a number of months in Connecticut establishing the first green bank, with relatively small funding. But then we established more, and the Inflation Reduction Act, the act included $26 billion for green banks, $6 billion of which is going to the Coalition for Green Capital. So I think that was a very successful initiative. In 2014, I left the Coalition for Green Capital and became president and CEO of Al Gore's organization, the Climate Reality Project. And at Climate Reality, we had offices in 11 countries. We had about 150 chapters. And we trained in 3-day trainings over 40,000 people to become what we call climate reality leaders, become involved in advocating in many different ways for climate change. I then left Climate Reality Project in 2022, sort of wanting to slow down a little bit. It turned out to be a little bit. And I went as a senior resident fellow to one of the think tanks called the Atlantic Council, where I founded a program called Financing and Achieving Cost Competitive Climate Solutions. And we've done a lot of papers so far, and that's where I am now.
Yeah, very interesting papers, by the way, all on subjects that are dear to us here at Climate Chat. We're going to talk about LCOE, the cost of renewable energy, and that's one of the papers you did. Carbon credits and whether they're valuable or not, and also how do you fund the energy transition in the global south? 3 huge subjects, each deserving of their own hour. But let's start off with the Climate Reality Project. First of all, I was in one of those very first training sessions back in, I think, 2007. I think of maybe the third one or something. And I actually knew a lot about climate change already, so I didn't learn as much from Al as many of the others. But I did learn a lot about presentation. They had a fantastic person in terms of teaching you presentation skills and things. But back then in 2007, The Inconvenient Truth had just come out. Climate change was a new subject for much of the public. And having people that could go to community centers and groups and give talks seemed to make a lot of sense. What's the purpose now? I mean, I don't think that's happening as much. Individuals going off to give talks. I could be wrong, by the way. But what is the current purpose of the Climate Reality Project? What's its goals and what is it achieving?
I think the primary goal of the Climate Reality Project is to build public support for addressing climate change, and do that by various kinds of advocacy, and do it not only in the United States, but around the world.
That's
Because
true.
if you go back to 2007, for example, public support was still at its very, very early stages. Climate was not a major issue in campaigns or in places like that. There are a lot of scientists talking about it, but we were a long way from getting the public support we needed to really transition to a clean energy economy, which requires fundamental changes in the economy we have it now. It's a major task. It needs major public support. So we thought one of the ways to build that support is to train people who can go out and advocate for the climate, explain to people why we need to take action, get them to support needed efforts, legislation, state, federal, local. And that's what they've been working on. And, we now think we're really at an inflection point. We're getting very, very close to the stage we need to pass the kind of legislation in the United States and in many countries around the world that are needed to make the energy transition happen quickly enough. there's going to be an energy transition, but the way climate change is working, we don't have forever to do it. Climate change is getting worse. People are worried that we'll get to a point where we can't stop whatever's happening on climate change, that there'll be forces put in motion that are unstoppable. So we have to move quickly on this. And we think we're getting to the stage. The Inflation Reduction Act of a year or so ago had like 360 billion, I forget the exact number, in support for energy projects in the United States. 5 years before that, we would have only got a fraction of that amount. And, I'm hopeful if this election elects people to support climate change, we'll be able to have another round and major progress in the United States and around the world. And, Climate Reality Project, there are many groups, but Climate Reality Project is trying to play a leading role in building advocacy for all these measures.
So again, when I was there a very long time ago, the real focus was on individuals getting trained and going out to give talks in their community. Is it different now? I mean, is it more about lobbying policymakers? Or what's the focus of the current group coming in? What are they asked to do?
Well, it is more now, because originally, you're right, people were just trained to be advocates. We then decided that we really needed to go beyond that and, sort of organize those advocates so they could work together to bring about change. And so we set up chapters in the United States. We set up branch offices around the world, and we have regional directors, and, people are working together, not only to give presentation, that's part of how you build the advocacy, but to go beyond that, to take steps you need to bring about the changes necessary.
Okay, great. So I have to ask you, what's it like working with Al Gore? How is he as a well, I guess he's the chair, but the boss? What do you like to work with?
But I work closely with. He is a terrific person to work with. He's incredibly knowledgeable about this. He spent his whole life really learning and understanding what's going on in climate, working with experts, developing ideas, and he's still one of the, if not the leading advocate for bringing about the change we need. And working with them is always interesting and exciting, and you always learn something. Okay,
well, great. So the future, I guess, where do you see the future of Climate Reality Project? Is it becoming an important piece of that advocacy, or anything new that that's been announced that maybe we're not aware of what new things Climate Reality Project's doing?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, it's developing. I left 2 years ago, so things have obviously changed a bit since I was there. But I think the fundamental goals are the same. They're just expanding. They're developing, new specific programs to work on. And, the trainings they're doing are getting very interesting. I mean, in the last year, I think they did trainings, for example, in Ghana and Korea. So we're really expanding this. They're really expanding this to work around the world. And, obviously trying to work with other groups.
Okay. Let's switch gears. The Atlantic Council is a think tank working on climate and energy, and you're a senior fellow there. You sent me some of the papers, like working papers or whatever, policy papers, and we're going to jump into those. But before we do that, maybe give us a little bit more on what the Atlantic Council is and what it does.
The Atlantic Council is a very, very large, what we call in Washington, think tank. Essentially, it does studies and it does advocacy on that. We're a little bit unique in the sense that we tend to not just publish reports, but we tend to try and help them develop into action. So after we write reports, we have webinars, we have meetings, we meet with senior officials on this. We'll do legislative work. We'll meet people abroad. It's a pretty big organization. We have, I think, close to 300 employees and 600 fellows. There are not that many. I'm a resident fellow, and then there are non-resident fellows. So I'm sort of on the staff. But we have 600 fellows we can work on. We have 16 different centers in there, one of which is the center I'm in, the Global Energy Center, which concentrates on energy. But for example, I think we're the leading think tank on advocacy and studies of what's happening in the Ukraine now. And I could go on and on. Very active in Eastern Europe. In the energy area, we're involved in many, many different aspects of it, from a major nuclear program to hydrogen to critical minerals. So we're working on major aspects of policy in the energy area. And in general, as an organization, we do that. We meet with very, very senior officials, leading country leaders all the time in the organization.
Wow. So one of the papers you worked on is called, actually, let me go to screen share here, and that way everyone can see. Share screen. Here we go. Hopefully everybody can see this now. So this is titled Transitioning to the Clean Energy Grid, a deep dive into the levelized cost of electricity. So levelized cost of electricity is LCOE. Can you, first of all, just start off and tell us briefly what that is? And I'm going to pull up this chart that you guys did that you provided here of LCOE costs of different kinds of energy. But first, what is LCOE?
LC really is a comparison of the different kinds of costs of electricity. And for our purposes, it's really comparing the cost of fossil fuel generated electricity with the cost of renewable energy generated electricity. And, I'm particularly interested in that. And because I think cost is really critical here. In order to have a rapid transition, renewable energy has to, and it has in fact become cost competitive with fossil fuel-based energy, as we argue and point out in the paper. In fact, it's cheaper now. And the same thing holds for electric vehicles. Electric vehicles in the U.S. are still more expensive than fossil fuel-based vehicles. That's getting to the point where they're cost competitive. But I think you won't see. We're seeing a lot of sales of electric vehicles now, but I don't think you'll see the explosion of sales until they are fully cost competitive, and they're getting there.
I think this is the year, really, well, especially with the subsidy. It's cheaper to buy an EV today, but equivalent quality. I mean, not a cheap car, but yeah.
I mean, it's definitely cheaper over the life of the
for sure.
vehicle. There's still a higher capital cost in a lot of places, but that should be, as you're saying, either this year, next year, the year after. We're getting to that point again where hopefully things will have an impact on that. So we really looked into that and tried to understand what was going on here. And again, the basic conclusion we reached was that it's cheaper to generate energy using renewable energy than it is using fossil fuels in the United States and around the world, in most places around the world. Right now, gas is very, very inexpensive. And so in existing plants it is. But
the red line here is the gas combined cycle. So this is quite low all the way from 2009. It remained low till 2022. But looking at solar here, it started off 2009 at over $350, I think this is per megawatt hour, and dropping now to about $65. So that's super cheap. And the other one that's also super cheap is the blue line, wind, which came down a little bit at first, and it's not as dramatically, not as big a drop, but still very, very low. And then next is gas, and the next one is what's purple is geothermal. Then coal, which is slightly rising. And this one I think is very surprising. The green line is nuclear, and it's going up over time. And that's a little bit of surprising. One of the few sources of energy that's rising over time.
It's probably because the new nuclear plants were built in Georgia, which were so expensive to build.
Yeah. So that's LCOE, and a lot of people know LCOE, but there's another one called LACE. Can you tell us what LACE is? I'm going to pull up this is a chart showing comparison of LACE and LCOE.
Yeah, again, you're looking at a broader set of factors when you look at LACE and to try and determine the cost. You may be looking at factors, for example, intermittency, how much you have to build more renewable energy. In other words, I made an example. This isn't a real one. You need to build 2 gigawatts of renewable energy compared to 1 gigawatt of fossil fuel-based energy because the renewable energy is intermittent. And we looked at that. And even at the LACE level, renewable energy is competitive or becoming cost competitive with fossil fuel-based energy.
Yeah, by the way, so LACE stands for levelized avoided cost of electricity, right?
Right.
So this is like the value generated by
Yeah,
by the energy.
right.
And the
And,
other
like,
LCOE is the cost. So cost
right.
versus value.
And the value is, of course, a bit of a subjective judgment because I think most of the LACE analysis don't include the externalities of fossil fuels. They don't include the cost of pollution um, or the cost of climate change resulting from that. But even with leaving that out, the numbers are becoming pretty strong on this. What none of these numbers include, and just one important thing is that we've concluded that it's cheaper to generate renewable energy than fossil fuel-based energy. Doesn't necessarily mean it's cheaper to deliver it, because for new renewable energy, you have to build out a whole new transmission system. We have to connect everything. We have to deal with intermittency, and we are working on a second paper now on how to on really where we are in that. Where is the delivered cost of electricity from renewables compared to fossil fuel-based energy, and what can we do to lower the cost of the new build-out of fossil fuel-based energy?
Right, like interconnections and
right.
making it easy to connect these things to the grid. But the summary of this graph, because it's like, what does this all mean? So the orange or reddish is the LCOE, or the cost of the type of energy, and the names are at the bottom. And then the blue is the LACE, or the value. And when you look at the ones in the white side on the left, it says ultra supercritical coal, offshore wind. Well, I was surprised to see so different here. Advanced nuclear and biomass, and all of them have costs way above the value provided.
Right.
So these would not be useful for society. You're paying a lot more than what you're getting. But the ones here shown, combined cycle natural gas is the first one. That's like traditional gas generated electricity. Geothermal, onshore wind, standalone solar, hybrid solar. What do you mean by hybrid solar? What's combined with hybrid? Like it's a hybrid batteries and also,
yes,
or
right.
Yeah. So solar with batteries, and then hydroelectric. All of them are, the cost and the value are similar. So these could be worthwhile, I guess, to society. Yep. And the big thing you just said, by the way, which I don't think should be overlooked, the costs here do not include the 8 million people who die every year from the burning of fossil fuel, from pollution alone, not climate change. 8 million people a year is estimated by Harvard Medical School study. And also all of the costs of climate change, which could be the entire economy sometime if we're not careful. And so this is not even, I mean, the fact that we haven't included those costs is sort of the reason we have climate change, right? Because we haven't factored in the damage. Do you have suggestions or techniques or something of how to include those quote external costs into these calculations so we could understand from a societal point of view what we're getting ourselves into here?
Well, there are probably models out there that do that, but but you can't get people to necessarily understand it, or economists to really push these externalities. It's just not the way they normally do things. But it's something we can talk about, and it's critical to talk about. If you look at the left side of the graph, with offshore wind and advanced nuclear and biomass being more expensive, remember, if you go back to the chart we looked at, these costs are coming down rapidly also.
Right.
With the new technologies, you have to keep in mind the new technologies are much more expensive when they're first proposed. And a lot of these come down a cost curve, very, very quickly, as you saw on wind and onshore, as you saw with solar and onshore wind. And so I would expect that these are also going to come way down. It's very important, though. I mean, for something like particularly advanced nuclear, which we're all in favor of, we're hopeful that as they build these new kind of reactors they're talking about, these small modular reactors, that they will come in cost competitive. Otherwise, they're going to have a hard time getting built. Wind is getting enough subsidies and stuff, offshore wind, and people willing to take the risk to build those out right now. And that may happen with new nuclear also, which is still a few years. The first plant is still a few years away from going online. But every plant you build, you begin to understand it better, and it probably lowers the cost. And so we've got to come down that cost curve. And that's what, we'll be trying to help out with legislation and things like that, in the next few years.
I should say, by the way, I have links to all of these papers that we're talking about today are in the YouTube description. So anyone's interested in reading these themselves and looking at the details, that you're welcome to do that. And so please see the YouTube description for the links. In this particular paper, they do talk about how to, if you did have a social cost on carbon of a couple of $100, that it would essentially double the cost of fossil fuel energy, I mean, roughly speaking, but you can take a look at that. I actually had David Archer from the University of Chicago on my program of like 3 years ago, and he did a study of what would be the cost of carbon if you didn't discount future damage. You didn't do the discount rate, and he came up with $27,000 a ton versus $50 to $200 is what we're assuming now. And that because the damage continues for like 500,000 years,
Right. I mean, and we don't need that. I mean, if we do the social cost of carbon, social cost is an effort the government has done and others have done also to try and figure out what the cost is of carbon pollution. We have those numbers. We put them in. Obviously, the people who don't support carbon challenge every single number on that, and it's, they're not traditional economic numbers, but it's very compelling also, and the paper does lay that out in great detail.
Okay, and then the next one, so again, we could spend an hour talking about this, but we're gonna jump around here, and that will also give time for questions at the end from the audience. But the other thing you covered, which I found really interesting, is it's entitled "The Flaws in Project-Based Carbon Credit Trading and the Need for Jurisdictional Alternatives." And let's see if I can. Maybe I should just pop it this way and do a share again. So first of all, tell us, I mean, for the folks there's a lot of confusion over what carbon credits are. There's carbon removal, there's carbon offsets, there's carbon credits. Give us a general idea of what you're speaking about here in terms of carbon credits.
Yeah, there's been a view that if you can monetize the value of successfully addressing carbon, you can generate funds that are needed to bring about change. I might as well talk about forests right now. So the idea here is if you develop a project, that's been the traditional idea, we go beyond that, but if you develop a project that saves forests that would not otherwise be saved, that has value. And somebody should be willing to pay for the value. So that develops, people have come up with the idea of a credit. You get a credit for the amount of carbon reductions or carbon sequestration you have, and you can then sell that. Carbon offsets are when you then take that credit and use it to offset emissions from somewhere else. So, for example, if you're a coal plant, I don't think they'd use, if you're a coal plant, you can offset some of your emissions by buying carbon credits. But it's more likely a business where you're, for example, if you're Amazon and you're delivering products and you're dealing with gas-based vehicles and they're switching to electric-based, if you're dealing with gas-based vehicles, you can buy a credit that offsets the emissions that are resulting from the emissions that are from your vehicles. There have been a whole series of issues with these carbon credits and offsets. First of all, if it's an offset, people question whether it's a good idea at all. Is it a good idea to let countries in the developed north not reduce their emissions because they can buy emissions in the developing south and these kind of carbon credits? That's been a big issue. There have been issues even when you do it in a cap and trade system, which has been proposed, where if you reduce your emissions more than you're required to, you can sell that excess to another company. The issue with that, of course, is that it means that if you have a plant in a polluting area in a poor neighborhood, you can keep it open by buying carbon credits. So that's become, very, very controversial in the United States. The benefit of this is we really have a tremendous need to protect tropical forests from a carbon standpoint, because it sequesters carbon, from a biodiversity standpoint, because it protects biodiversity, and from an ecosystem standpoint, because it presents ecosystems. And if you start tearing ecosystems apart by deforesting or whatever you're doing, they lose all their resilience, they lose their carbon credit basis, and so you're suffering real injury by doing that happening. So everybody sat there and said, well, how do we protect the forests in Brazil from the United States? And, there are lots of different efforts. There can be direct grants and things like that. But one way to do it is to say to Brazil, well, if you can, protect your forests, somebody will pay for it. A company will pay for it, a government will pay for it, or whatever else it is. That process has run into a series of major problems. One is it's been based on a project. So let's say you're saving 50,000 acres somewhere. The first thing, the problem is there are standards that are set as what you have to do. It has to be something that's additional to what would otherwise happen. There can't be leakage. There can't be, you can't cut down other areas to make up for the area you cut down. So the first set of problems is that processes work very poorly. There are a lot of studies out there saying a lot of these credits are not real. Now, there are people out there trying very hard to come up with very good standards, and they're working at it, but there's still a tremendous amount of room for gaming the system. There are a tremendous amount of complications in using additionality in particular that I think make it a bad standard. So from that sense, the project-based credits are really not working. Then there's a second issue on that, which is, I think, in some ways, the most important one is, let's say you do 100 projects in Brazil and you save, I'm making up a number now, let's say you save 100 acres. While those 100 projects are saving 100 acres, in other parts of Brazil, not being done by the people doing the projects, 200 acres may be cut down. So in fact, there's not some value to it in saving 100 acres, but it's not enough because we have to decrease deforestation. And project-based projects, in my view, very, very unlikely to do that successfully because you can't get them to the scale needed to deal with the problems in a place like Brazil, in at least good projects, in the amount of time we have. So what we've done in this paper, and a lot of people looking at this now, said, okay, we have these project-based out there, they're not working well. Is there an alternative? The alternative we looked at is to say, well, let's look at this on a jurisdictional basis. If, for example, Brazil or a state in Brazil, and the states there are very big and have huge amounts of forest, or an indigenous locality, if they can reduce overall in the entire jurisdiction their emissions, that would work. So in other words, if Brazil was deforesting 100 acres a year, and now because of this, they've said we will go to 95 acres a year, we know that they have now started decreasing their deforestation across the entire jurisdiction. And we think that is something worth paying for and worth supporting. And it's what you need to be successful in climate change. It's also easier to monitor because you can monitor the entire stock of forests now.
Country.
It's easy to prove that. Now the government is involved. You don't have a lot of the problems of gaming the system by private investors who are wealthy, who are negotiating with, much less sophisticated local people in these deals. So we think there are a lot of advantages to that, and that's something that we now support, these jurisdictional credits. Now, whether they should be used for offsets is still an issue. And it's ideally if they're not used for offsets, if governments or companies buy them but don't use them to offset their emissions. And I'm not sure how that will work out yet. That's something we're still looking at.
So let's take a look at that. So I'm a cement plant or something. I'm going to emit 1 million tons of emissions, and I want to be, quote, green or meet some target I have. So I I pay indigenous people somewhere in Brazil to not cut down their forest, and I do that. And it's hopefully not one of the 90% of these credits that some group you quoted said are worthless because of all the reasons you just said. Let's even say it's a good one of the 10%. I still emitted my 1 million tons. There's 1 million tons of CO2 in the atmosphere. Nothing has offset that. So, isn't carbon credits, in a sense, a way of delaying the net zero? They're like indulgences, right? I'm going to commit a sin here and emit 1 million tons, but I'm going to pay you some money and you go do some good stuff with that money, please. I still emitted 1 million tons. From a systems point of view, I'm thinking it doesn't work. The math doesn't work. There is no actual offset, I guess, is the way.
Well, there's no reduction. There's no reduction in carbon because of this. Because we're now committing 1 million tons, and they're protecting 1 million tons, so it sort of wipes itself out. I mean, I guess this, if you were emitting 1 million tons before, and now 1 million tons are being sequestered in another place, and that's new, you are getting some reduction in the carbon you're doing.
That's
but what it does,
carbon offset. If I pay someone to remove 1 million tons from the atmosphere, and I do it at the same time that I'm emitting, because there's differences in time frames here, but let's say this, and they're measured tons out of the atmosphere. They're very expensive to remove that way, by the way. But if I did that, then okay, I have a net thing. But the forest is there. So you're just saying it could even be worse than you say if I cut it down. Okay. But
right.
I still emitted 1 million tons. There's nothing offsetting the 1 million tons.
Yeah,
Not cutting down a forest doesn't offset 1 million tons of emissions.
right. Well, I mean, reforestation might, but generally, I agree. And there are other problems with offsets, and that is it gives the cement company, for example, has an incentive not to do what it needs to do, which is develop carbon-free cement. So we don't generally support offsets. And the question on credits is, can we get people to buy them who aren't using them as offsets?
Oh, okay. What are they using them for?
They're not, well, they're not, they're just using them. They're not using them. It's a way to pay the people in the forested areas not to cut down their forest.
Okay, well, that's good. But is that really happening? Are there people? I'm not surprised. It's not used by companies to quote offset, like, I don't know, the airlines. I could pay an airline a few extra dollars for my flight. I thought they're using these forestry credits to quote offset. Okay, so that one is a use of it.
Right. You have both of these things going on at the same time. Obviously, enabling them to be used as offsets encourages a market because you've got a whole bunch of buyers who will benefit from using the credits. If they don't get it, that market is reduced. Hopefully we can get governments to come in or companies to do it because of their commitments to protect, the environment, even if they're not doing that. But it makes it harder. And remember, protecting forests has other benefits aside from carbon. It's got, of course, biodiversity benefits. It's got benefits to the local community. It's got other benefits too. So it's a complicated question. But at a minimum, we want to see this whole process shift from individual projects to jurisdictional based, where you really are getting protection of forests in a way you weren't before, in a way that has an impact on protecting climate change. It's a combination of stopping things from deforested and reforestation of places. So there are a whole bunch of things that go into the carbon credit.
Now, isn't the best way to do it, though, is to have these countries ban deforestation? I feel it's like a little bit like paying people not to murder people. Here, I'll give you some money if you don't murder people. Wait a second. No, you're not allowed to murder people. Full stop, and we'll arrest you if you do. By the way, I'm very encouraged that for the first time in history, we actually have the technology available today, and it's only in the last 5 or 10 years, that can actually monitor all parts of the earth every single day. And so that first road that goes into an area to start the deforestation process, it can be found in a day or so, and police or army can go in. I mean, it's not happening, but I'm saying technically it could happen if we did have policies to restrict or eliminate deforestation. I assume you support that. It's just maybe hard to get countries to agree to that.
Look, well, of course we support regulations, and we work on that a lot. The simplest way to do everything here is by regulation. The problem with getting it done by regulation is not as easy as one would like. And if you're Brazil now, there are costs of regulation if you do that. There are tremendous costs on enforcement. That go into the passing this regulation. Right now there's a huge amount of illegal deforestation in Brazil. There are pretty good regulations out there. So to some extent, you're trying to create the economic incentives to stop that illegal deforestation and to give the country the resources it needs to stop that deforestation.
Yeah, I'm saying, and the new thing is that there is technology for the first time that can monitor all areas every single day, which is, I worked on actually satellite imaging 40 years ago. I mean, every week or two, you might get a pass over a particular area. Now it's every single day or multiple times a day. So it's pretty amazing.
That's a tremendously powerful tool. If you do an individual project, people go through incredible lengths to try and figure out what's going on. If you do something on a country basis, you just do this, this aerial this aerial um, uh, monitoring. And, as long as you do it the same every year, you've got the same baseline. That's what you really want here. And I think it's a great tool. We couldn't do this. You couldn't do it on a jurisdictional basis without these new technologies.
So let me ask you a very high level question, something you just said, which I think sometimes the most important things just get just passed over. As you said, the obvious thing to do is to put policy in place. And for example, to address climate change, we have all these incentives, the Inflation Reduction Act giving subsidies here, but of course we're still subsidizing fossil fuels. What is it when, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging? And the way to stop digging is to phase out fossil fuels. That's the obvious, it's really obvious that that's what we need to do. Anyone involved in climate would agree. And so the easiest way to do that, instead of carbon pricing or subsidies, is to phase out fossil fuels. In this case, the best way to deal with deforestation is to eliminate deforestation through policy. And yet this is, as far as I can tell, it's not even on the agenda. It's not like it's trying to make its way through Congress and it doesn't quite have the votes. I mean, it's not even a subject being discussed. And you're someone who's involved in that level, of policymakers and business and things like that. Can you just comment on that observation?
Yeah, I mean, in Brazil on forests, they have, of course, passed a lot of legislation. And, we've done a lot of regulation in the United States, too, on this. We haven't passed new legislation or anything in the environment for decades, but we have done regulations here. Look, it's just proven extremely difficult to pass regulation. And again, some of that is because the cost of this is high. There are winners and losers in the economy when you do this kind of work. And one example of economic incentives is you're trying to put it in everybody's economic interest to do this. And then in the places where you can't do that, for example, impact on workers who lose their jobs, then the federal government or state governments can come in and hopefully, deal and hopefully address those kinds of issues. So, in an ideal world, you would start with regulation on everything. And here we need lots of new regulation and legislation. But then you would fill in the gaps in various places where you try and make it economically, give people economic incentives to bring about this transition. It just makes it easier. We get more public support. And, you're always on a balance line here of having enough public support to do what you want to do. Because they're not only winners in this process, they're also losers. And the losers.
Well, the losers would be fossil fuel companies in this particular case, right?
Well, but it's more than that. I mean, it's any business that has to transition away from lots of things that, maybe not electricity generated, but there's, lots of businesses have costs that relate to that. I mean, for example, replacing all of your fossil fuel-based vehicles with electric vehicles. I mean, that may not be a great example, but that's an easily understood example of a cost the business will incur in doing this transaction. You could mandate they do that, let's say over a 10-year period. That, again, would be the most efficient. You'd probably get more public support and pass it more easily if somehow or other there were incentives included in that to do that.
No, I agree. Actually, I think it's a great example because EVs, first of all, the costs are dropping rapidly. So, but at the end of this decade, there won't be any question of what car you buy. It'll be cheaper, faster, better, autonomous, whatever. But in the meantime, because we're just doing it that way rather than managed, there's going to be a lot of bankruptcies among probably the legacy car companies who didn't transition fast enough. And the government's not trying to protect everybody. And that, Kodak went out of business and BlackBerry went out of business. I mean, when things change, that happens. And we now know, as you said, and we're not even counting it very much, the cost of fossil fuel energy is far higher than any other form of energy when you include all the costs. And society does have to pay all the costs, right? So I don't know. It just seems, to me, it seems strange that the obvious solution to, by the way, an existential problem. We're not just talking about, a little tiny thing here. This is like whether our society will exist later this century. The the way to do it is really obvious, and it's not that we're not doing it; it's that we don't even talk about it. I think that's the interesting thing.
Well, I mean, certainly in the environmental community, people talk about new legislation all the time, just they haven't been able to pass anything for decades.
Okay.
And,
Well, maybe, maybe we'll
and that
change
could
that.
change. That could change because public support is building. But right now, we're just a super deeply divided society over this.
Yeah, we got to get through the next election to have any chance of doing anything, I guess. Yeah. I do think my personal opinion is that as climate damage increases, and it will increase, like 10 years from now will not be like now, and 10 years after that won't be anything like now. There will begin to be a call for real action on climate, and that's when policymakers, I guess, will feel empowered to do real things. Unfortunately, we're going to have to go through some suffering until we get there.
Yeah, I mean, again, just as I said before, there's no doubt we're going to do this transition. The question is whether we'll do it fast enough.
Yeah,
and I think we're getting there. I mean, I think we're close to an inflection point on this. If this is a good election and the pro-climate forces win the House, Senate, and presidency, I think we'll probably see another round of major legislation in 2025 and 2026. And then we're getting close. Then we're maybe one more round away from getting the laws in place we need and the financial incentives in place we need to get all this done.
Well, that's good. By the way, I had Mark Jacobson on a couple of weeks ago, and he's advocating obviously for 100%. And he said, just going to happen anyway, cost, even from a cost point of view. I agree. I think it's going to happen. The question is how fast and that kind of thing. What kind of speaking, this is kind of appropriate way. Your third paper is on how to fund the energy transition in the global South. These are developing countries, poor countries. They're the ones getting hit by climate change right now, far more on sort of an average basis than the developed world. I mean, we still get all of the impacts, but we have far more resources to respond where they don't. And so it seems to be an unfair situation. The developed countries caused the problem. The developing countries are getting hit by the problem, and they should be funded to react and to get resilient and build clean energy, et cetera. Can you just tell us a little bit about, I'll try to pop up this paper while you're talking. Tell us what your paper is about in terms of funding Global South and what your conclusions were.
Great. Well, to start off, there's a tremendous need to get investment in the transition to clean energy in the Global South. The International Energy Agency estimates that by 2030, we're going to need $2 trillion a year of investment in emerging markets and developing countries. Last year, I think it was last year, about $260 billion was spent. So there's a gap on that of about almost $1.75 trillion in that investment. $1 trillion. And there's just no way that money is going to come from governments. It's just a very, very, very big number. And it's hard to get, in the billions, let alone in the trillions, and the amount of money you're putting into this. So we looked at it. The question then is, there are multilateral development banks like the World Bank that are out there, all working to increase investment in the emerging markets and developing countries. But there's been a problem with it, and they can't do it either. Their programs aren't scaled up enough. They're trying to attract private investment, but they're not really structured in a way that's really worked on it. They're too bureaucratic. It's too slow. Things are not done the way that private investors do it. There's been relatively little private investment in the Global South. I think in 2022 in this area, it was about $67 billion, out of the $260 billion that went into that. So we think that the only way to bring about the investment you need, if governments can't do it, is you have to increase private investment in emerging markets, developing countries. And again, we don't think that the existing institutions, the World Bank and other multilateral development banks, really have the structure or could have the structure to enable them to attract the kind of private investment they need. When we looked at it, we said, so really, why aren't we getting the kind of private investment we need in the Global South? Because, investors will go there. I mean, there's loads of money around. They will go there if the project is not too risky and if they get the rate of return they want. The problem is they are really tremendously worried about the risk of investment in the Global South. And that comes from two sources. One is really worrying about the risk. The second, though, is they don't have enough information. Investors are very conservative until they've looked at a large number of transactions and sort of, can really evaluate well what the risk of the transaction is. The result of that is that A, they're not investing, and B, the interest rates required are very, very high, and C, the profit they make, they look at a number on how much money they need to make is much higher than it would be in other investments. So in looking at this, there's become a pretty general consensus that the best way to reduce this risk and increase these investments is by using guarantee facilities. And essentially what those facilities are is they guarantee the investment in certain ways and against certain risks. And again, the World Bank does that. It's just not a very, very significant stage, not the 1.7 trillion stage we need to be able to do this. So we at the Atlantic Council, with the help of an investment banker named Ian Callahan, developed a concept which called the Emerging Market Climate Investment Compact. And we were trying to do a couple of things on that. First, we wanted to do something that reached the needed scale. Putting $10 billion when you need 1.75 trillion is not going to do it. And it has to be attractive to private investors. And it has to reduce the risk enough so that it's attractive to private investors. So what we did is we came up with a big facility. It's still not as big as you need, but we felt that you begin to reduce the risk and investors start understanding it, they won't need a special facility. And that facility is called the Emerging Market Climate Investment Concept. Our idea was to support $500 billion in investment in emerging market and developing countries over a 10-year time period. Now, again, if you look at what's been spent in the global south and what governments are willing to put up, 500 billion seems like a giant number. When you look at it closely, it's not. Because the really advantage of guarantees is you only need to put up enough cash to cover your expected losses, what the guarantees have to pay out on. So if you take a conservative number, and let's say the loss is going to be 10% on your investments, and that's a very high number. That means over 10 years, you need to put up $50 billion a year. The way we would fund this is by having developed sovereign countries invest in that, maybe big foundations, like Bezos and others, which have the funds to do this. We would ask, for example, 10 countries to put up the amount of money they needed to deal with the $50 billion in investment. Now, again, they've only got to put up $5 billion a year because it's only 10% of that 50 billion. So it's 10 years, so it's 10% of 500 billion, which is 50 billion. And then you've got to put up the cash to cover losses of 10 billion, of 1/10 of 50 billion. That's $5 billion a year. If you have 5 countries doing it, they only have to put up $500 million a year each. That's still not a tiny number in the real world. It should be, but it's tiny, not a tiny number. But we think that's a doable number, that countries would be willing to do that. They, by the way, do have to back that up on unexpected losses. This is 10% expected losses. They would back that up with sovereign balance sheet guarantees. In other words, they would ultimately guarantee that. But they won't have to put up the money, and the expectation is they would never have to put up the money when they do that. And we tried to create a facility that's very investor friendly. In other words, we decided we would guarantee almost all risk except for currency risks in a portfolio of guarantees, not a single guarantee. So we would go to, let's say, a BlackRock and say, if you agree to put up $20 billion in investment in emerging markets, we'll guarantee you losses on those investments up to a certain percentage, probably not 100%, but because of the risk of that. But let's say, whatever we decide when we model is the right number, 50, 75, 90%. We would guarantee the whole portfolio, or we would cover individual losses. And we would do it in a way that's friendly to you. Right now, for example, if the Multilateral Development Bank does a project with BlackRock, they call it blended finance. Both those entities, BlackRock and the Multilateral Development Bank, would do an environmental impact statement. That's tremendously slow. The negotiations are very ponderous. So what we would do is we would create a standard relating to risk, relating to environmental and social goals of the project, requirements of local involvement. We put all that in. Then it'd be up to the investment bank to meet them. They would do the environmental impact statement. We wouldn't do it. They would come up with the agreement that comes up with what they have to do on environmental, social, and governmental goals. And we would essentially go in and we would spot check that to make sure it's all correct.
I mean, who's the we when you keep saying we? We is not the Atlantic Council. Is it a
No,
new?
it'll be EMSIC, the Emerging Market Climate Investment Compact. So that'll become an entity that would do
And
that.
that's like it's an NGO. It's a nonprofit, or not a government.
Right. It would be a not-for-profit, although it's all government funded.
Yeah, government. So it's a vehicle that multiple governments and companies can interact with that collect these guarantees, collect money to guarantee these much bigger loans, and then they basically provide the guarantees to the people lending the money.
Yep.
Or
Okay. Yeah. And we would include things like we would require a few basis points worth of a tiny percent worth of their investment to go into a fund to build local capacity. We would do the kind of thing you need to make this successful.
And now, it sounds to me though like this is also essentially a private. I guess it's government and private, but it sounds like the right thing to do is just have governments do this themselves. But it's a little bit like, let's just get rid of fossil fuel. But this is also, is this related to also the loss and damage work that's being done at the COP conferences as well?
No, I think loss and damage is separate from this. It's an important issue, but this is all investment related, future investment related. So we'd have an entity, we call it a facility. We'd have an entity that would do this. We would place it somewhere. We're thinking maybe in one of the Nordic countries that, have funds like this. So there are plenty of funds out there doing this. This would not be the first fund. This is not the first idea. It's just different in scope and concept. We probably discussed it now with 150 people. We've had multiple webinars on it. We've been meeting extensively with Treasury about it. We've been looking up at the Hill on how you would fund it. It is all 100% dependent on the election, of course. But we're hopeful that if the election goes well, there'll be the incentive for new legislation that would help provide the backing we need to do this kind of investment.
Okay. Well, it's great. So again, there's so much, like all of these issues deserve full hours on their own, but we're running out of time. I'd like to move also to get some other questions in, and I want to invite our co-mod Stacy, if you're there, Stacy, to join us and with your question, and perhaps you also have some other YouTube or Zoom questions as well.
Hi. Yes, I do.
Yeah,
Thanks for joining us, Ken. Very fascinating work. You've been around the block, the climate block, that is.
I'm old.
Well, we're all getting old, but you've done quite a bit. And I appreciate you being here. On the credits, it seems like there's at least two issues. What is being put up currently and what has already been put up? And then thinking about the Global South, we're talking about preserving biodiversity, and then also the economic challenge of advancing their infrastructure and fledgling economies. Couldn't we put a price on each of the tons of carbon that are up there and bill the countries responsible for it? Because we in the US have put up the most and clearly benefited the most, as we are on top of that GDP pile every year. And shouldn't we be paying countries for what we have already plundered in our own land and help them to preserve what is there, but also get a better way of life?
Arguably, yes. The question is, can you do that? And getting that kind of funding is hard. One of the advantages of credit is it gives you something specific to pay for to help fund this. That's clear and understandable in what you're doing. We could is the key word, because could doesn't necessarily translate into we will. So we're trying to do something that we think will work in the world today. You could have a carbon tax, but again, you've got to get a carbon tax in 190 countries, which is not easy. Carbon taxes have been proven very resilient, very difficult to get in the United States. And there's some questions about them because they do raise costs when you do it. And we don't want to raise the cost of renewable energy or forest protection. So it's a complicated world out there when you try and bring about that kind of result. Loss and damage, of course, is designed to cover a lot what you're talking about also.
But raising the cost of Big Macs wouldn't hurt. I mean, we need to start putting a price on something. And I do find, like, if Gaia could show up and just say, hey, people, this is wrong, and start handing out the bill, that would
Well, I think Gaia is actually starting to do that quite directly. We're not necessarily recognizing it as such, but that's what's happening.
But
by the way, Ken,
bill
on carbon pricing, I will say that that's an area I work in with Jim Hansen, and there is a particular one, fee and dividend. We not for today, but that does address some of the issues. The costs do go up, but since the public gets all the money collected, bottom 70% of households make more money on the dividend than they pay in higher prices. And that actually helps make renewables more cost effective, because the fossil fuels will get more, relatively speaking, more expensive. But that's a whole other discussion. I'll try to convince you that that's the way to go.
Well, you know, my colleague at the Atlantic Council, George Frampton, before he came here, ran an organization working on carbon pricing.
Okay.
So, you know, so he's come here from there, and, you know, we're not emphasizing carbon pricing right now because, you know, in reality,
Yes.
there's no chance of getting it in the United States.
No, well, at least, yeah, right now.
It's
That may,
tough
that may change, but right now, no.
because, I mean, there's a morality to it, you know, like we have benefited the most, and it's hard.
Morality doesn't seem to affect global policy towards
Right.
economics. That's not, people are not doing that. I mean, as I agree with so much of what we talk about on Climate Chat, by the way, is this could, should, would, will. I mean, I always tell people that there's many things that we must do, and must being defined as, if you don't do it, you will suffer unacceptable consequences. That's what must means. And there's many things we must do, and we're just not doing them. we're just choosing not to do them, and we're going to suffer unacceptable consequences. We are already to some degree.
I mean, I think morality works more for individuals, you know, people like myself and Dan and people working on this. The morality of it is an important factor in it. It's harder to get morality to affect the whole society, though.
That deserves like a whole hour right there.
Right.
Stacey, do you have any of the YouTube, other YouTube?
Yeah,
questions?
somebody mentioned, can I get carbon credits for not mowing my lawn? Which I thought was kind of hilarious, that, you know, what are we actually giving credit to?
Yeah, monoculture is destroying the habitats of having, if you have grass.
And the other one, somebody mentioned, when you think about these things that the natural events, et cetera, and the ones that are, you know, we caused it. Our park fire here in California that is taking off, you know, that was a mentally ill individual who set fire to his mother's car and pushed it into a ravine. And now I don't think we'll get to Canadian scale because we'll run out of fuel before it gets that far. But it's
350,000 acres.
What are we up to?
350,000 acres.
Seventh biggest wildfire ever so far, I think. But by the way, I want to make a point on that, because it makes it sound like this was human caused. But all fires are human caused or caused by lightning. That's been true forever, and it will be true forever. But the difference is, when the conditions are different, any individual fire that gets started can end up being 350,000 acres versus 50 acres, right? Depending on how dry the wood is and dry the atmosphere is and all that kind of stuff. So
I guess it's more of a putting in your Atlantic Council suggestion box for a paper is about healthcare and mental health care as a preventative tool or adaptation, or, I mean, it's like, we need that. We're going to be suffering physical effects and mental effects. And certainly here in the United States, where we don't have public health care, this is a real issue. Yeah, maybe it would prevent some forest fires.
Okay, thanks. Hey, Eli, do you have a question for Ken?
Well, a couple of things. You mentioned the elections this year. I just kind of wanted to suggest that we need something concise that could put people running for Congress on the record to do specific things. And what I, suggest is committing to go go twice as quickly and twice as broadly on the goals that have already been passed in the Inflation Reduction Act. And along with that, in the context of what was just discussed, seriously beefing up firefighting capacity and compensation for firefighters,
Okay.
because they, they're
What-
saving us. Right.
What's your question for Ken?
Okay, so I put a couple of papers in the chat. One of them is actually a preprint that came out almost 2 weeks ago, observing that the natural carbon sink was essentially zeroed out during 2023, mainly by wildfires and drought in the Amazon rainforest. Netting the uptake to zero, so all of our emissions in 2023 were not balanced against natural sinks. Now, of course, it's a preprint, could be wrong. The direction is unsurprising. The extent is surprising. I know we want to be quick. The other thing I put in there, though, is a paper that looked at how quickly the Amazon recovers from droughts. And it recovers, but it doesn't recover completely. And we are likely going to be confronted by more such unwelcome observations and surprises. And we need to formulate a discourse that goes much further than just the net zero discourse, which is getting traction, but it's getting traction in my opinion, and a lot of other people's opinions, far too late. So I'm wondering your thoughts about all of that.
Not sure I completely understand the suggestion.
Well, I think he's saying that our plans are being disrupted because the Earth is taking in less CO2 than it used to mitigate. By the way, it mitigates half our emissions, right? The oceans take up half, land and soils take up, 25%, I guess, each. And then, and that's not happening. So we're in worse shape than we thought. As you attempt to protect forests, which is still a good thing to do. I'm just saying they're having less of an effect. Any thoughts on the fact that maybe your general climate change is getting worse than people thought, faster than people thought? Is that making your job, people paying more attention to the work you're doing because of that?
Yeah, I mean, look, we're scared to death by what's going on in the Amazon and places like that. And it's, there's a real risk to the Amazon in general from all this. From a practical standpoint, we can't stop. Well, Brazil can stop a lot of the fires. I mean, a lot of them are set by people deliberately, to clear their land. So Brazil can take steps to do that. And from our standpoint as the United States, and where we are the best, we're trying to protect as much forest as we can to try and, have more forest being protected than is being cut down or destroyed by forest fires. I mean, they both fit in on that. So, we certainly agree that that's a major problem right now. And, we're all trying to do something about it and trying to understand it fully. But things are happening. One of the scariest things is all the models show one result and things are happening faster than the models are showing. So that makes it even more scary. The models are scary enough at their current pace.
Agreed. So now we're going to go to some audience questions. Please limit it to a question, actually, not a comment, question, and keep it to 30 seconds. And I first have to make Eric. Okay, Eric, you should now be able to unmute and turn on your video if you like.
Hey.
Hi. Oh,
Hi, Eric.
I think he disappeared. I think he hit the wrong button. So now we're going to go to Philip, and we'll get back to Eric when he rejoins. Hey, Philip, welcome. What's your question for Ken?
Hi, thank you very much, Dan and Ken. I just wanted to ask your thoughts on biochar. I understand that biochar is like 95% of the carbon credits in the voluntary market. And then just another question, if I may, with regards to projects that people invest in, obviously expecting some kind of return. Some of the restoration projects needed here, like invasive alien plant control, etc., does not, it's difficult to derive profits from that venture. So, what kind of projects specifically are being recommended for land restoration purposes generally and carbon sequestration? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on biochar, so I'm going to skip that question. But as far as project goes, there are a whole range of ways that you can protect these areas. I mean, you can do direct protection, you can pay grants, you can pass regulations, you can give other kinds of incentives. So there may be projects that the kind of work we're doing on guarantees, for example, doesn't work because it doesn't attract private investment. We're trying to, get the trillions and trillions of dollars of private investment that's available out there to go into these projects. Again, that may not cover every single project, and there may have to be other ways to get those projects done. And we're not saying that guarantees and what we're doing is an exclusive way of doing it. It's one of many, many different tools that people can and will have to use in the years ahead to achieve the goals we're trying to achieve.
Okay.
And again, I'm not an expert on biochar, but there's a huge amount of carbon credits now that are really not valid. I'm not sure how much, I don't know how much biochar fits in that, but the criticism of these projects has been extensive.
I think biochar are probably one of the real ones because, but and we didn't even have a chance to talk about, even though it's in your paper, about the fact that planting trees is not really the same as removing carbon, which lasts in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, and the trees provide, I think the paper said, around 20 years of sequestration. So there's a mismatch there. There's a lot that subject deserves an incredible amount of talk. But we covered many different things, Ken. I want to thank you so much for your time today. We covered the climate project, we covered LCOE, we covered carbon credits, and we covered funding the global south. Each one of those would normally be a huge discussion on its own. Kind of interesting. I kind of enjoyed the fact that we sort of jumped thing to thing and really hit the high levels of all those. And the fact that you've been involved in all these for all these years, I want to thank you for being one of the real warriors, real climate warriors out there for, as you point out, for a long, long time. And thanks for all you've done. Thanks for what you're doing. Love to have you back sometime so that we can maybe dive a little deeper on some of these. But I really appreciate your time today. And to everyone out there in the audience, take a look in the YouTube comments description, where there's links to the papers that we talked about. So you can read them in detail. There's a lot of information in there. By the way, just for a program note, next week is Genevieve Gunther, who's wrote the book on climate, the language of climate politics, or is it the politics of climate language? One of those two. And we're going to be talking to her next week. So that'll be really interesting. Thanks to everyone. Please subscribe to the channel so you get notified of upcoming programs. You can also follow me on Twitter at DanMiller999. In order to do that, you can also follow the Climate Reality Project, the Atlantic Council. Do you have Twitter too, Ken? I didn't.
No, I'm really not active in Twitter, right?
So you can do those other two groups you can follow. And there's a link to the Atlantic Council as well, and Ken's bio there. So a lot of information in the description. Thank you so much. And please like the program as well so it gets shared with more people. Thanks, and we'll see you next week. And Ken, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan.
Right.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.